used to report errors, especially in circumstances where errors cannot be reported locally. Let's take a working copy of exceptions.cpp from our Chapter 8 folder in our exercise files, and we'll go ahead and paste this in our working project and open it up. I'm going to maximize this so we can see the whole thing, and I'm just going to take a moment and page through this for the folks who are typing along at home. This file is based upon the constructors example from earlier in this chapter. The C++ language has complete support for exceptions. For our purposes, this movie is just a quick introduction. In this case, we want to do some error checking in a constructor, and exceptions make that really easy. So let's start at the bottom, and you'll see that we're constructing this object inside of what's called a try block. So on line 72, we use the keyword try, and that's followed by opening and closing curly braces with code in between. And everything inside of that block will be executed in this try block. And so if any exceptions happen during that block, then the catch block is immediately called. And the catch block here has an argument, which is the exception type. It's a reference to an exception object, and we'll see what that means in a minute. And it simply outputs a message to standard error using CError. And it uses that exception object, and it calls the method on that exception object called what. And that will have a description, a human-readable description, a string, to describe the error that happened. Up here at the top, I have a class that's based upon the exception object, and this is a very, very common way to do this. My class is called E, a capital E, and it disallows the default constructor on line 11 by declaring it in the private scope. And in the public scope, it has a constructor that takes one argument, a C string, and it also has a method called what, which is overloading the what method in the exception base class. And again, this is a very common way to do this. So there's a couple of things here that you might not recognize. On line 13 in the constructor, you see it says throw with an empty pair of parentheses before its initializer list. And what this syntax means is it's specifying what exceptions are allowed to be thrown from inside this function. And that list is empty, and so it's not allowing any exceptions to be thrown from inside that function. And that's actually pretty important in the exception class itself, that the exception class doesn't throw any exceptions, because then it could get called recursively and it could create more problems. And so we've done the same thing in the what method, and you'll notice that it's also declared as a const safe method, and it simply returns the message. So this is a very, very simple way to derive a class based on the exception class. And you can take this exact code and use it to great benefit in your own programs. This is pretty much the way that I do exceptions most of the time, is just with that little piece of code. Now, the way that this works, you'll notice our constructor here in our animal class, down beginning on line 35, it simply checks the arguments that were passed, and if any of them are of length 0, it throws an exception with a message that says insufficient parameters. And so when we run this, because we've actually called it this way on purpose, if you look down here, we're calling it with an empty parameter there for the sound. And so when we compile this and run it, you see that we get a message that says animal X insufficient parameters. And if we look up here at our constructor, there's our exception that gets thrown, a little temporary E object that's constructed with insufficient parameters as its string. And so that'll set it up to have what return that string. And when we come down here in our catch clause, we see that we call what on that object, and we get that string there. So this is really a very simple way to take advantage of exceptions. Exceptions in C++ have a lot of different ways that you can use it and a lot of things that you can do with it, but 9 times out of 10, you just need it to give you an error message. And so this is a great way to do that. So this is just a quick introduction to exceptions in C++, but it's a useful example, and the E class can easily be adapted for your usage. Now let's delete our work.